By now, you've probably heard that cooking and cooling your pasta or your rice or your potatoes can increase the fiber content thanks to the magical properties of resistant starch. But there's a lot more to this story than just cold potatoes. Today, we're going to go beyond the basics to explore the different types of resistant starch, what they actually do in the body, and how to spot them in the wild. Welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, where we take a closer look at nutrition news, research, and trends so that you can feel more confident about what you eat. I'm your host, Monica Reinagel, and today's episode was inspired by a question from Jerry, who wrote, "While listening to your May 13th episode on multigrain versus whole grain, you briefly mentioned resistant starch. And I've been seeing resistant wheat starch listed in the ingredients of some high-fiber breads, and I'd love to understand exactly what that is. So how is the 12 grams of fiber per slice different from the fiber in, say, beans or oats?" This is such a great question. And you know what, Jerry? I was recently wondering the exact same thing. Does the fiber that we get from products made with resistant starch provide the same benefits as fiber that we might get from whole foods? And the answer is somewhat complex because resistant starch isn't just one thing. There are actually multiple types of resistant starch, and each of them have slightly different properties. And they don't all show up the same way in your diet or on a food label. So today we're going to take a closer look at the different types of resistant starch, how they compare to other sources of fiber, and how you can include more of this in your diet, whether that's through your own cooking or maybe by reading between the lines of packaged food labels. Now, most of the starch that we eat, what we might call regular starch, is made up of long chains of glucose molecules. That's right, glucose. So even though it's essentially made of sugar, starch doesn't actually taste sweet. And that's because in starch, those glucose molecules are locked together by bonds that need to be broken down by digestive enzymes before that glucose can be released and then absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, most of that happens in the small intestine. But your saliva also contains small amounts of an enzyme called amylase, which starts to break down starch the moment you begin chewing. So I remember doing a fun experiment in about the 5th grade or so that demonstrated this in a very memorable way. And you can even try this at home with your kids. So you chew a plain, unsalted saltine cracker for long enough, and it will start to taste faintly sweet. And when that happens, you are literally tasting the starch being broken down into sugar on your tongue by those enzymes in your saliva. Okay, that's regular starch. Now, resistant starch is also made of glucose molecules, but the bonds that hold the molecules together are resistant to those starch-digesting enzymes. So instead of being broken down into glucose molecules in the small intestine, it passes through to the large intestine intact. And so because it escapes digestion in this way, resistant starch behaves more like fiber than starch. And in fact, it is officially classified as a type of dietary fiber, and that's how you'll see it listed on the nutrition facts labels. But not all resistant starch is the same. And in fact, there are several distinct types, and each has its own characteristics and sources and applications or uses. So far, there are 5 generally recognized types of resistant starch. And in this episode, we're going to focus primarily on RS2, RS3, and RS4, because these are the forms that you're most likely to come across. But just for the sake of completeness, let me round out the picture for you. RS1 is found in whole or very coarsely milled grains, legumes, or seeds. So more finely milled products like whole grain flour are going to contain less RS1 because the physical barriers that make the starch resistant will have been broken down in the milling process. RS1 is generally heat stable, so it won't be affected by cooking, and it would simply be included as part of the total dietary fiber. And then at the other end of the list, RS5 is a newer and less well-known category of resistant starch. It forms when starch molecules bind with certain fats, creating a structure that resists digestion. So these complexes can form naturally in foods that contain both starch and fat, especially during the cooking process. However, we don't yet know a whole lot about how this type of resistant starch might behave in the body. And because it's still being studied, you're unlikely, at least at the moment, to see RS5 mentioned on labels or used intentionally in food products, at least for now. So let's look more closely at the types of resistant starch that you're more likely to interact with. RS2 is found in foods that contain uncooked or minimally processed starch, such as raw potatoes, underripe bananas, green bananas, or certain strains of corn and wheat that have been bred to contain high levels of RS2. And some of these are processed into specialty ingredients like green banana flour or high amylose cornstarch, which is sold under the brand name High Maize. And there is a special strain of wheat that is naturally high in RS2 that is milled into a flour marketed as Health Sense. So these ingredients are typically used in commercial food manufacturing, but a few of them are available for home use. For example, I purchased a resistant starch powder made from high amylose corn just to see what it was like. And I actually found it a little tricky to work with because it is such a fine powder that it's kind of hard to measure. It really makes a mess. And another important feature of these forms of RS2 is that they're generally pretty heat sensitive. So high or extended heat is likely to break those bonds that make it resistant to digestion, in which case you will have turned it into regular starch. But you could add it to smoothies or yogurt just to add a little extra fiber. 1 tablespoon of the stuff that I bought, for example, contains about 5 grams of fiber, but also 5 grams of regular starch. Another consumer-facing product is the all-purpose baking mix that's made by King Arthur Flour, and it features that special strain of high RS wheat that I mentioned earlier. So this mix looks, performs, tastes just like regular white flour, but thanks to all that naturally occurring RS2 in the wheat, it is significantly higher in fiber. So it can sometimes be hard to detect the presence of these RS2 ingredients in commercial foods because while they may be identified as resistant starch or high amylose flour, they could also be listed simply as cornstarch or wheat flour, in which case the higher fiber content might be your only clue. The third category of resistant starch, this is now RS3, is technically described as retrograded starch, and it's formed when certain starchy foods are cooked and then cooled. During the cooling process, the starch molecules rearrange themselves into a molecular shape that resists digestion. Now, you probably remember this was a bit of a sensation a few years ago when we all learned that you can increase the fiber and decrease the carbohydrate and the calorie content of foods, such as potatoes, rice, or pasta, by allowing them to cool and then eating them cold or just gently reheated. And that is something I talked about on this podcast way back in 2009 and then again in 2023. So that's retrograded starch, RS3. And finally, I want to talk about RS4, which is not found naturally. It's created through the chemical modification that makes starch more resistant to enzymatic digestion. So the main advantage of RS4 is that it is much more stable, heat stable, than either RS2 or RS3. And that makes it attractive to food manufacturers who can use it in high fiber breads and tortillas and snack bars and baking mixes. It's a little bit easier to spot RS4 in the ingredient lists because they are typically labeled as resistant or modified starch. As I said earlier, all of those different types of resistant starch are classified as dietary fiber, and that is where you will find them listed on the nutrition facts label. And here's an interesting side note. Measuring the fiber contribution from resistant starch is a little bit trickier than with other types of fiber because it requires simulating both the chemical and the mechanical aspects of human digestion. And all of that has to be done on the final product and not just the individual ingredients because heat or other processing might change those molecular structures. But anyway, as we talked about in episode number 560, dietary fiber can be sorted into different categories. So there's soluble versus insoluble, there's viscous versus non-viscous, fermentable versus non-fermentable, and so on. And these categories play a role in the specific health benefits. You can learn more about all of that in that episode number 560. I mention that because I want to help you locate resistant starch into that landscape. So generally, it is non-viscous, and that's important when it comes to food formulation. It is largely insoluble, and it is fermentable, which means that it provides a good food source for your gut microbes. And resistant starch is also usually fermented more slowly in the gut than other fermentable starches or fermentable fibers, and that may mean less gas or bloating when you eat it. But what do we know about the potential health benefits? Well, I want to start with the area where the evidence is strongest. Because resistant starch isn't digested and absorbed like regular starch, replacing digestible starch with resistant starch can lead to a smaller rise in blood sugar after a meal. And this is pretty well established. So a meta-analysis of 13 different clinical trials found that supplementing with resistant starch, and that was anywhere between 10 and 45 grams per day, led to reductions in fasting blood glucose, fasting insulin, and HbA1c, particularly in overweight and obese adults, but those both with and without type 2 diabetes. Now, those effects may be due in part to increased production of short-chain fatty acids, especially butyrate, which helps to regulate blood sugar metabolism. And there's also some evidence that resistant starch may improve insulin sensitivity and satiety by promoting GLP-1 secretion. There's also some research suggesting that resistant starch may improve cholesterol levels. So in a meta-analysis of 20 different controlled studies, resistant starch supplementation led to reductions in total cholesterol and LDL, or bad cholesterol, particularly when consumed at doses above 20 grams per day for longer than 4 weeks. And those improvements may be the result of that resistant starch binding to bile salts in the gut and then increasing excretion. And then resistant starch also acts as a prebiotic, serving as a food source for beneficial gut bacteria. Accordingly, consumption of resistant starch has been shown to increase the levels of acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Those are all helpful chemicals created by your gut microbiome that help support gut barrier integrity and reduce inflammation and modulate your immune response. And exactly what effects you might get are going to vary based both on the particular source of resistant starch that you're using, but also your own baseline microbiome composition. Resistant starch doesn't seem to do much for promoting regularity. For that, you'd probably want to look for other types of fiber. So here's the good news. Whether you are cooking with a high amylose flour, or you're cooling your rice and your pasta, or you're buying products that are made with modified starch, introducing more resistant starch into your diet appears to offer the same types of benefits as other prebiotic fiber. And in that sense, it would appear to be just as legitimate a gut health strategy as eating more beans and legumes and other high fiber foods. With that said, though, variety is still the best strategy. Resistant starch shouldn't replace other fiber-rich foods like beans or vegetables and fruits and whole grains, but it can be a great complement. And including resistant starch in your diet can be as simple as enjoying cooked and cooled starches like pasta or potato salad. Or you might incorporate green banana flour or high maize cornstarch or a high RS flour into your smoothies or your baked goods. Or you can take advantage of the increasing number of breads and pastas and other products that are leveraging resistant starch in order to decrease digestible starch and increase the fiber content and those benefits. Thanks so much to Jerry for the great question that sparked today's episode. As you can see, it was kind of a big topic, so thanks for sticking with me through that. And thanks as well to Katie Harris. She is a food scientist who works for Bay State Milling. That's the company behind the high RS wheat flour that is used in HealthSense flour. And she works with food service and food manufacturers to develop new products. Katie spent quite a bit of time with me, helping me better understand the intricacies of resistant starch. She even sent a few products for me to sample in order to allow me to share the best information with you. So thank you to Katie and Bay State Milling. And if you have a question that you'd like me to answer, you can email it to me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. I'd also love for you to check out my other podcast. It's called The Change Academy, where we explore the art and science of creating positive behavior change in our lives, in our workplaces, and in our communities. Just search for Change Academy wherever you listen to podcasts. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Steve Riekeberg is our audio engineer. Holly Hutchings is our director of podcasts. Morgan Christensen heads up podcast operations and advertising. Thanks also to Nat Hoops for his support. And most of all, thanks to you for listening.